I think, we're all adapting to a new world of self-containment and, also thinking through how do we keep our industry moving forward. Front and center in our minds at Medable is how do we continue research and keep participants safe. I think is a tech company in a position to deploy new tools, we've seen a number of interesting developments and really feel that we can come together as a community to play a really important role in enabling research to move forward. It's been a very interesting last couple of weeks, and our hearts go out to anybody who's been affected by COVID in the communities, the families, and the individuals. And I think it's also a time for us to come together to provide solutions. And people are worried about not only the illness, but the impact to the economy, the impact to the industry. And I think Medable as a company, we're also worried about the trials that are in flight, the important research efforts that those have underway, some of those, many years in a process, and how do we continue those important efforts moving forward during this, really new and unprecedented time. So today we're just going to have kind of a candid conversation about some of our experiences over the last couple of weeks as we've, attempted and successfully deployed new technologies into studies that were formerly really not using virtual telemedicine or remote patient monitoring. And the idea here is, really just an opportunity to provide a lens from the Medable perspective, open it up to questions. And really our goal during this time is to be part of a broader solution and to, show up with tools, ideas, approaches, but really more than anything, just a commitment to really helping our industry during this challenging time. So it's meant to be interactive. Please do send questions. I'm really excited to be joined today by two of the women I work with on an absolutely daily basis at the front lines of deploying decentralized trials. Both Allison Holland, who has over 20 years of industry experience as a general manager, has overseen over 300 global clinical trials, and Ching Jian, who has a similar level of experience and formerly oversaw is a GM of decentralized trials at Novartis. So, our team has been working literally day and night. I think we've probably been putting in anywhere between 14, 16, 18, 20-hour days, really with the goal of providing solutions. As I mentioned, we've learned a lot, and this really all ties back to our mission, which is to, really accelerate the processes that enable participants and patients to have effective therapies. So I think, probably all companies in the tech space and in the healthcare space are being pulled in a number of directions to say, how can you help here? So what we want to do is, again, review our experience, and really starting with Allison Holland, also known as Allie on our team, providing a high-level overview of how quickly things really evolved and how the doors have really started to open to deploying new technology strategies into the current trials, and really how quickly that's kind of come to fruition over the last week, 2 weeks. So Allie, I'll hand it over to you.
Michelle, hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I think what's really clear is that as this pandemic evolves and as our responses evolve, we're learning an awful lot, and the regulators and the ethics committees are learning with us and trying to adapt with us at the speed with which this is evolving. So we're not going to go through detail of all of these guidances today, but suffice to say that everyone's taking this very seriously about how do we ensure in this current environment, number one, preservation of patient safety, that in the 50,000 trials that are ongoing around the world, that we are able to complete the assessments on those patients and ensure that dosing remains effective and safe for them to continue, and that we are able to also maintain primary data integrity, so that if we switch to collect or observe data in different ways, that we're able to do so in a way that ensures that that data is still collected with the same amount of rigor and assessment as is required. Obviously, the primary requirement is that we are able to collect data that allows for physicians to have effective oversight of patient care, whether that means the patient is in front of them or remote to them. And the guidances are very much there to help support that, suggesting and requiring us to continue the risk assessments that we ongoingly use during a clinical trial deployment in general life anyway, that we should continue to assess those risks and make sure we take appropriate steps to be able to evolve to those. Those appropriate steps could look all different. So what we're offering here are some solutions that might work collectively as we assess that risk assessment and think about what options do we have available at our fingertips that we can offer to our physicians and our clinicians and patients that might enable them to have more effective oversight of patient safety and data. So most of the guidances comment on the ability to switch to remote monitoring, to look at televisits, to look at telephone calls, to look at a deployment into the home environment that might not be standard and might not have been how we were planning to conduct the studies. But in this current environment, those pragmatic changes that reduce the hazard to patient safety and ensure that we are able to keep those patients safe, not only within the constraints of the clinical protocol and the dosing of the drug, but also reduce their exposure to having to travel around picking up coronavirus for some of these immunocompromised patients as well. So we're really looking at what's in the toolkit that we can offer. If we move to the next slide, we're all familiar with the opportunities for a decentralized shift in clinical trial design in general. We've been talking about this for a number of years. You'll have heard terms around hybrid studies, virtual studies, decentralized studies, direct-to-patient studies. Collectively, we're all looking at the same thing. How do we take a traditional study that used to be run as a one-to-one of a patient visiting a physician at a site, and how do we enable that physician-patient relationship to expand in a remote setting such that the patients who live more remote to sites or in a completely diverse geography are able to access clinical trials in a way that offers them opportunity for a healthcare option they might not have been aware of before or could have been part of before. So we think about our patients being geographically dispersed, and the opportunity that brings to reduce down the bias in our studies by having more population representative patients being able to access clinical trials. So those steps and that methodology were already in existence that enables us to start to look at diversifying the way in which a patient can access a study. But what we're seeing right now are for those in-flight studies, what assessments can we take and what steps can we take for an in-flight study that hadn't planned for a remote setting and had been set up previously for traditional? What can we do in flight to enable some of this switch across that means that we are able to assure that patient safety and data integrity during this time of turmoil? Michelle, I'll hand back to you for the next discussion.
Okay, great. I just want to highlight on some of the key challenges that are, need to be addressed as we think this through. So it's, how do we keep patients and clinicians safe? I think right now, as we can see with the measures really worldwide, it's about self-containment and, really doing things more from an in-home setting. I think the question around how do we capture critical data, there's different phases to this. I think in the immediate term, it became critical data in being captured really through any methodology where you could still really conduct that visit, and that would be done with telemedicine to capture those visual assessments or endpoints that would related to physiologic data through wearable devices. And I think there's another method for that with more time for preparation. This is kind of the immediate near-term solution. There's a question of how patients get these devices. This is certainly challenging in a setting where, you know, a number of communities don't have access to some of the more mainstream, capabilities that would be available. But certainly, one of the current demands and needs is to ship these devices directly to patients' homes, whether they're wearable devices and or even potentially medications. And then the question about how do we really enable sites to suddenly go from a clinical setting to one where people are working collaboratively, you know, in from their own homes as the clinicians, as I alluded to. So, you know, as a physician myself, I think that it's a really interesting challenge for the sites, but one that certainly can be addressed. And there's just a number of different steps and learning points that we're continuing to uncover as a team, and likely will be doing as an industry over, you know, the next couple of weeks to months. So let me hand it back to Allie to start to address some of the pragmatic and practical changes that are really needed.
Thanks, Michelle. I think when we're looking at assessing the in-flight study and really starting from the perspective that one size isn't going to fit all here. This isn't a magic solution that is just going to fit to every protocol, but that as we start to think about the risk assessment in a protocol, the length of time a protocol still has to run, the availability of IMP and comparator medications, and how much supply is available, whether it's feasible to slow down or stop recruitment, or feasible to slow down or stop dosing, or whether there's more risk to a patient by doing so, and therefore having to put in place steps that allow us to observe patients more closely and enable that dosing to continue. We need to look at what stage the study's in, how well known the drug is, and what effects are expected from the drug. And there are some data points around maybe lab safety values that might just not be available or accessible to us, but are there other markers that we can use as designated indicators that would enable us to get some level of assurance about what is happening to the patient in their home environment, so that the physician can be confident that their oversight of the patient is good enough that allows the patient to be safely maintained within the study parameter. So we should be looking at every and all opportunity around the study in the risk mitigation, which includes stopping the study, but also includes offering different support to extend the study. And those supports could look very differently. So, you know, maybe it's that we can launch a televisit and have televisit eyes on a patient. When a physician has eyes on a patient and are able to read those visible cues from the patient in their responses, able to observe the patient doing certain tasks and tests that the study protocol may have required. Maybe it's a dexterity test or a measurement test that the patient can physically complete in front of the physician in a secure and HIPAA-controlled environment. Maybe it's a skin assessment or a rash assessment, observation of an injection site area, or so on. There may be opportunities country by country to look at support by home nursing. There are a number of companies that are still able to operate and deploy home nurses to the patient's home to conduct certain assessments. Maybe that also could collect some phlebotomy, but also what can the nurse do when they're at the patient's home, maybe under the televisit supervision of the PI as well. So that could be a combination approach that by allowing the physician to oversee the interaction, collection of that data may not be as ideal, but more data is better than no data in some cases to be able to make sure that we can observe patient safety. So obviously this is going to be dependent on the safety profile of the compound and the dosing regimen and so on. But these combinations of factors, looking at what's available and how we could put these together in a solution set that different physicians and patients can choose how they wish to access, means that we are able to do a lot more than necessarily having to stop protocols in the first place. So as we think about some of those activities, we really need to be looking at what's the primary endpoint on the study that we're looking to observe. Is it something that we can do remotely? Do we have a length of time? And what are the time periods by which we need to deploy? Michelle's going to talk us through this case study here, which is a very rapid deployment and shows what can be possible. But obviously on other studies with more complexity, we may need a little bit more programming time or configuration time to be able to do something more complex.
Sure. So, this again, just in the vein of kind of transparency and looking as an industry at, the challenges and the solutions, I just wanted to discuss, one example of what some of the solutions have been over the last 2 weeks. So we have a partner, who's conducting a trial, very hard to recruit study, and a key component of the study is in Italy. So you can imagine, a number of challenges are posed by that. Is one of the sites, and one of the key sites is in Italy. So the question becomes, we've got a patient who is in the time frame for a primary endpoint data collection, and specifically this is in dermatology, and how do we really address that? And can we, still capture that primary endpoint? And I think, again, this is in the vein of looking for solutions, and if we had known what was going to happen here, certainly there would be a different solution put in place, right? If we had weeks or months to prepare for this. But I think that, with the lens on, let's enable a solution, let's enable that primary endpoint collection to happen, and then let's take a stepwise approach towards, further enablement of the study through decentralization. One of the solutions that we've put in place for this in a very rapid time frame was quite simple. So, the study was underway. It's using technology that was not the Medable solution to capture the outcome assessments and to capture the clinical data. And this was previously being done through face-to-face visits. And so, the question came to us, could we facilitate this with telemedicine and the existing technology infrastructure? And, in the vein of wanting to be a part of it, and also importantly, enable the participant to continue moving forward and contributing, really the key time and effort that they put underway to still have a lot of value for the study, we of course said, yeah, let's do it. We enabled our telemedicine solution, as I mentioned, to be a downloadable app. We worked with the sponsor on the consent form, translated that with our partners from TransPerfect in a matter of 2 days or less into the native language consent. Patients are able to download the application, go through the consent process, which really is, in this case, a lightweight consent that's just discussing the form factor of telemedicine being the way to communicate with the physician. And then for that study visit to be able to be conducted, ideally to continue the primary endpoint collection, and also to just be able to evaluate and connect with the patient. Now, I think, again, this isn't the end all be all solution, but in times of need, we want to provide solutions and now have a strong sense of, how do we then in a stepwise fashion modify this to be a fully decentralized or fully direct to patient study, for the in-flight study. So I think the important takeaways here are really that we need to move to systems that are really a bring your own device in this setting, and the fewer shipments of devices unless they're essential wearable sensors is an important strategy. I think the importance of being able to work with partners to facilitate the documentation needed quickly, and Ali will walk through a number of lessons learned, but specifically being able to get those consents, into the native language and provide the consent for the new processes. And then, being able to work with the site staff and the clinicians. In this case, we were all training site staff on Saturday, and enabling everyone to connect remotely to do that training, to then continue to push that study forward. Really is a streamlined and lightweight technology solution that can be used in the setting of existing technologies, just so it's not disruptive, but it's facilitative. So this is really some of our experience over the last, couple of weeks to enable in a really lightweight way some solutions to get into the hands of patients and into the hands of clinicians who are, again, displaced to their homes and remote. And I think that it just speaks to when working in partnership, with a set of collaborators, what can be done over a really short timeline. So Ali, you want to hit on some of the key lessons learned?
Yeah, definitely. You know, one of our goals when we deploy a decentralized trial is to be as frictionless as possible for sites. So we want to not be adding infrastructure and adding extra steps for sites and patients. However, in this particular circumstance right now where we're deploying, we're really looking at trying to make it as frictionless as possible between the systems that are already deployed. So part of the risk assessment as to how to deploy, not only looking at patient safety and preservation of data integrity, is also looking at what options already exist within the study parameters or within the healthcare environment, and then what gaps are we trying to fill. And it may not look the same for every study, every site within a study, or every site within a country, or even every patient within a study site's oversight. So what we're looking is giving options around how to do that. When we're considering from the regulatory and ethics committee approvals perspective, we're really looking at what are we trying to do go forward? Are we collecting net new information, which might then require a protocol amendment? Or are we shifting the methodology by which we collect the same data and just providing tools to facilitate the discussions and the collection methodologies, in which case that might not require a full protocol amendment and might only require notifications of change. So really need to dig down into that. The regulations are changing and the guidances are changing very quickly, but really looking at that on a country by country and site by site level to make sure that whatever we are doing is not introducing compliance risk to the study over the long term. And then looking at that deployment and startup planning period. You know, we always talk about the importance of planning and on any study deployment. And when we try and do something very fast, we really need to make sure that everyone who is involved, all of the different stakeholders are engaged and have a voice in that team environment. So not making assumptions about what's going to work, listening to the user end of how they wish to engage with the patients and how the patients are going to engage with the site. Understanding what the standards are locally. So do patients have sufficient smartphones or do we need to deploy and be able to ship devices? That's going to have an impact on how quickly we can deploy. What we are finding is that many patients on the studies are happy in this circumstance to use their existing smartphones and making sure that we are able to guide them through the steps very clearly, including the changes to privacy statements and informed consents that will be required in order that all of the standards that we observe around the world for GDPR and so on are not compromised by us doing this. So there are certain standards you just don't want to stop. Having a HIPAA compliant, GDPR compliant platform in the first place helps to make sure that we're not going to introduce any risk around the misuse of any healthcare data and personal private data of patients. It also means that having a very agile configuration of software is key. For the example that Michelle offered just now, we took our original configuration and really stripped it back to make it very generic to the study because we weren't collecting any net new study information. We were facilitating the collection of existing data sources for the study through the ability of the investigator having eyes on the patient. So therefore, that meant that we could do something very quick. We still had to be able to translate it so that all the patients' screens and instructions and consent forms and so on were all in natural local language, and that we're able to deploy that fast. And that really means that those platforms that have highly configurable setups in the first place are able to be very responsive in this environment. But it means that we have to be very careful about what we choose to do within there, and make sure that we are not introducing error by skipping QC steps. That's very important that we can maintain. As we think about deployment, obviously logistics are key. So how are we going to provision if we have to get equipment or Bluetooth devices or wearables or to patients? Are the logistics working in local countries? What's the import-export impact right now? For countries that aren't locked down yet, can we get ahead of the curve? And we've got some clients who are thinking ahead to before things get locked down. What can we do to prepare that the study has its options available? For those countries that are locked down, you know, what are the realistic options for being able to get kit to the right places? And certainly with a BYOD setting, being able to enable the smartphone usage of patients is a really key advantage if we want to deploy quickly into patients' hands. Being able to support all this with training is key as well. Obviously, pitching technology on its own isn't necessarily going to fix the problem, but what we are able to do is look at how do we support the effective training so that everyone understands what they have to continue doing, start doing, and stop doing in order to be effective, and that we're not creating a lot of frustration for the physicians and the patients about how do they download apps, how do they engage. Certainly from our perspective, we're trying to make sure that everything is designed for ease of use, minimum clicks, minimum number of navigation points, so that it's very intuitive for how the patient usually uses their phones, and everything looks very familiar, so that they are able to really make sure that they can use it very effectively and be compliant with their data collection and televisit opportunities. And then to make sure that we've got real-time governance over this, that we reserve the right to continue to learn together as everything is evolving. This is moving around the world at the rate of knots. We don't have all of the answers, but together we've got a lot of collective brain power that can allow us to learn together. So very much we see that we have a responsibility to share these learnings so that we collectively across the industry can improve and make sure that we continue to offer best-in-class care for patients who are generous enough to support clinical trial engagement. And then thinking about it from a clinician-patient use perspective, obviously they are the ultimate considerations for how we design the applications, and they really need to be configured for their use. The collection and management of clinical trial data is almost a nice to have upshot of what the clinician and the patient are doing together. That by enabling that relationship and enabling that continuity of care, we're able to collect better data. So making sure that we actually build in the ability for feedback loops, that we're able to be adaptive and see what's worked and what hasn't worked and what would be better for people go forward, and think about where those other sources of data might be that also would help to augment the collection of patient data. So maybe there's an opportunity to look at data sources that already exist around patients' own devices that they already have in their house, and are they able to use those and support providing that information in a way that we can pull into a controlled environment so that we have good control over data management once we have the access to that data. So it's not normally how we would operate a clinical trial, but in these exceptional circumstances, being able to provide the clinician with more insight into the patient's health enables them to make at least the healthcare decisions. We'll have to look at whether that's going to be supportive enough for regulations go forward once we come out of this COVID-19 pandemic episode. So I think with that, Ching, you're probably going to talk about this ecosystem a little bit more and what might be available to us longer term.
I think you're on mute, Ching, just as a heads up.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Hi. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Sally. Yes, so I'm just going to take a look at some other options beyond televisit based on our experience and what we have been working on in our quest to fully enable virtual decentralized trials. For safety assessments such as vital signs ECG, while it's not possible to take virtual vital signs simply through a televisit, we can, however, use connected thermometer, blood pressure cuff, and pulse oximeter to measure patients' vital signs. There are also 510K approved CE mark certified ECG sensors for home use that can be deployed. Using connected devices, especially when they're integrated to a central platform, sites can remotely monitor patients effectively. And televisit can also be a very handy tool for patient training and assistance with the use of those devices. With many activities to take place at patients' home, you may also be concerned about source documentation and whether a distributed site team can share pertinent information in a timely fashion to ensure patient safety and study integrity. You may also have concerns on sending study monitors to sites that may not be accessible, especially in the case of hospital-based sites, to protect them from infections. To address those concerns, we think one component in the ecosystem to have a flexible mobile-based e-source solution can actually be very valuable to facilitate real-time data capturing at the site and source management and real-time sharing from anywhere, and also to facilitate remote study monitoring. Setting up eSource, even in the midstream of study, has the additional benefit to mitigate potential data entry delays and quality issues caused by the delays. And in the event you have patients that need to be transferred to a different site, the new site can have quick access to patients' record through eSource. Another tool I want to mention quickly here is patient reminder feature that is available in our platform and other decentralized trial platforms. With patients that can no longer visit the site for the foreseeable future, how do we keep that communication channel open between the sites and the patients while not adding a lot of burden on the site staff? Email, secure text messaging, and push notification can be easily configured to send study updates and reminders for upcoming activities to patients, including study drug dosing. If it is important to monitor medication adherence for your study, maybe you can consider setting up a very simple study medication ePro tool to document the dosing. We can reduce the burden on site while keeping patients informed and engaged through digital. And if you're still enrolling patients and are looking for ways to continue patient recruitment, you may want to consider adding social media campaign, partnering with patient advocacy groups to the existing recruitment channel, and use remote patient screening where it's possible, and getting patient consented remotely through a televisit to facilitate identity verification and questions that patient may have. So my final point is going to be about the flexible approach. When considering the options for your study, it doesn't have to be an all or none approach. It really depends on what makes sense to address your specific challenges in the study, whether it's in a certain countries or in at certain sites or with certain patients, as emphasized by regulatory agencies, ensuring the safety trial participants, ensuring the safety of trial participants is paramount. Although we may not have all the solutions today and in a fully integrated setup that we have been working very hard toward, we do feel we have a good set of options and tools at our disposal. Together, we can work creatively in helping sites and patients through this unprecedented time. So now let me hand it over to Michelle.
Great, thank you, Ching. So as you can see, it's, I think as a team, we're really coming together, and as a community and industry, really putting our heads together to address some of the challenges. I think just philosophically, Medable as a company feels that it's important for us to acknowledge the contributions that participants and research sites have made to these efforts, and just think through how we can enable the research efforts to continue, in a world where we are doing this in a safe form factor from our homes, and how we really enable that. So, it's exciting to see how many people have attended the meeting today. Our goal is just really to be helpful, to enable research to move forward, to keep participants and the clinical staff safe, and to help our industry as we all tackle together, this entirely kind of new world of challenges. So I think, for me specifically as a physician, my world is very different. My practice of dermatology, which I'm still practicing, has now transitioned to telemedicine. Our company is now rapidly moving everything, to facilitate a fully decentralized model. And, we are so eager to learn from other partners' experiences, and to really open up the dialogue to the Q&A. And then beyond that, to just, let's address and prioritize the challenges. Let's work together across these challenges, and let's not let this be an enormous setback. I think it's something we can tackle in a really intelligent way, so that, we can continue these important research efforts.